So we're going to be in section 3 of chapter 18. We're going to talk about the church shaped society and politics. Nearly everyone in Europe during the Middle Ages claimed to be a Christian. They may not have been. Sometimes it was political moves. Sometimes it was business moves. Sometimes it was just a fit in. It was the cool thing. And so everyone claimed to be a Christian. Clergy is known as church officials. That's the term for a definition for clergy. The teachings of the clergy was influential in European culture and politics. We don't really associate this much. We do from the standpoint a lot of our laws did come from some of the Ten Commandments, and some religious laws along with the Code of Hammurabi and some of the rest of this stuff. But we don't really know what it's like to have a government that's ran by the church. But their laws, their teachings, the things that they would do, the leadership was all based around the church during this time. In the Middle Ages, life in Europe revolved around the local church. They'd have markets, festivals, religious ceremonies, all taking place there, on up into the creation of the United States of America. In the colonial days, the church was the meeting house. The church was the school. The church was where they would have their festivals and things like that. It was a central part of society. To some people, religious pilgrimages became an important part of their lives. This led to people traveling to see important locations such as Jerusalem, Rome, and other places where Jesus and holy men and women did things. And, when it comes down to it, it could be something crazy like Jesus stopped and sat down here, and people would want to people would want to go and sit down there because Jesus did. It's the same thing. Not to compare Jesus to celebrities, but it's the same thing today. Like if some celebrity came to Phil Campbell and sat on the bench in the park for 5 minutes, people would be taking pictures on that bench like, this is where so-and-so sat at, taking selfies and things like that. It's what people do. When something's important to you, you want to emulate that as much as possible. Another popular pilgrimage location was Canterbury, located near London in England. Hundreds of years, visitors went to the Canterbury Cathedral, which is the basis for Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is a story of a group of pilgrims who felt drawn to Canterbury. Now, this is the introduction of the Canterbury Tales, or this is part of it. And there's a video I want you to watch on Google Classroom, which does the old English version of this. You can barely make it what it's like. And I just butchered it, but it sounds like that. Like it's hard to understand when they're talking about it. When I was in high school, we used to make a joke about the word pilgrimages, because on that version they say pilgrimages, and so we would walk around like my whole senior year. We talked about we read the Canterbury Tales and had to listen to it. It was like, and then they go on pilgrimages, and so it became a judge point that we put it in the yearbook as one of the memories our senior year because of that. But it says, when in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to root, then people long to go on pilgrimages and see, I even said pilgrimages. I don't know why. And palmers long to seek the stranger strands. Afar off saints, hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they went. And so it's just talking about their journey to Canterbury to see this cathedral there. The church also gained political power during the Middle Ages. The church was one of the largest landowners in Europe, dividing the land up into fiefs, basically making it a feudal lord. Now, we've talked about feudalism, and this is just a church version of feudalism. Some clergy advised local rulers, and sometimes neglecting their religious duties for political. They would become political advisors, and so a lot of times they would neglect their religious duties because they were giving political advice. Some people were unhappy with the political nature of the church and feared the church had become obsessed with money. Among the unhappy was a French monks in the early 900s who established a monastery at Cluny. They followed a strict schedule of prayers and religious services. The monastery at Cluny was very, very strict, and they didn't really like the political and worldly nature the church was going in. This just shows you their daily schedule, and it's crazy. Wake up at 2:30 a.m., prayers at 3 a.m., study religious text from 5 to 6, then they would have prayer again, study religious text again for another 30 minutes, then prayer again, church service, and a meeting. They would work in the field or copy books. They would have noon prayers and mass, eat the daily meal, work in the field or copy books, afternoon prayers, evening prayers, and go to sleep. A very, very strict schedule. They go to bed at 6:30, wake up at 2:30. How many of y'all would like to be on that schedule? The punks, a bunch of punk monks. These monks paid little attention to the world and concerned themselves with only religious matters. The changes at Cluny led to the creation of religious orders, and it was an example of how monks in Europe should be. Religious orders are groups of people who dedicate their lives to a religion and follow common rules. By the 1100s, some monks thought that Cluny's rules were not strict enough and created new orders with stricter rules. Some took vows of silence. Some others lived in tiny rooms that they only left to go to church services. Men were not the only ones to join these, with women joining convents as nuns. So some of the rules were very strict. You couldn't leave your room unless to go to church services. You had to pray all day. You had to spend long periods of time fasting. You had to read and record and write down religious texts all the time. Some became very, very strict about these schedules. Nuns lived by strict schedules also. They would join together for prayer and work in the monasteries. Although monks and nuns lived apart from society, they didn't give for the outside world. They would collect and copy religious texts. They would send all over Europe. They would help with schools. They would help with people in times of need, things like that. Not everyone wanted to join a religious order, wanted to live separate from society. This led to the establishment of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, which consisted of friars instead of monks. These friars are people who belonged to religious orders but lived and worked among the general public. And so friars were also like this, but they weren't as strict as a lot of these monks were. Friars lived simple lives, wearing plain robes and no shoes, and they, like monks, owned no property. They roamed around preaching and begging for food, and for this reason they were known as mendicants, for the Latin word for beggar. They're what we call a panhandler. They would stand out there and ask for charitable giving. The main goal of friars was to teach Christian teachings about generosity and prayer. During this time, the first universities in Europe was also created. Some of the earliest universities were created by the church as a way to teach people about their religion, and most of the teachers were members of the clergy, and these schools taught people on religion, law, medicine, astronomy, and other courses. And this is going to be where universities are first developed. The universities were being built, people started asking questions, how the religious teachings and human reason were connected, and some things were expected to be taken by faith only. This happens because God made it that way, kind of mentality. Some people believe that the two could be related, and this was used to try to promote Christian teachings while using human reason. This is going to lead to people like Thomas Aquinas, which was a Dominican philosopher that argued that rational thought could support Christian beliefs. This new type of thinking was also called scholasticism. He believed in natural law, which was the law that governed how the world operated. They believed in teaching worldly things along with Christian beliefs. They believed that arguing for rational thinking also supported Christian teachings. The church was a large contributor to art and architecture. Many of their churches were incredible works of art themselves. Gothic cathedrals were towering works of great majesty and glory that represented a symbol of people's faith. And so the church created places like that. Well, I thought there was multiple. But you just kind of see this is the Gothic style architecture. Artwork represented Christian beliefs. It included paintings, clothing, tapestries. Even the books were beautifully decorated because they represented this Christian art. Even monks added a thin layer of gold and silver to these books that they would describe as illuminated. And that's going to lead to the end of section 3.